This is On the Wine Road podcast. Today I'll be off the wine road and in the studio. Let's get to it.
Pinot Noir needed to be a low-yielding plant made the best expression. So we went to Europe after we had several vineyards planted to say, how can we mechanize this efficiently?
My guest today is Paul Sloan. As a young wine enthusiast working for a wine-themed restaurant and inn, Paul tasted a world-renowned French Burgundy Pinot Noir. It blew his mind, and he aspired to make a wine in a similar style. In Sonoma County, you can come close to making that style of Pinot Noir, but there are many factors that are dissimilar to those in Burgundy. Undaunted, Paul powered on, and along with his wife Kathryn, they pretty much achieved what they set out to do, after a quite involved, long and winding path. They didn't have a vineyard, couldn't afford one, and he didn't know how to make wine. As newbies, they were definitely starting from the ground up. I love this story, and I think you will too. You'll appreciate the obstacles they had to overcome to create their brand, Small Vines. This interview was recorded in September of 2021 on my weekly radio show called On the Wine Road Live. And without good reason, it didn't make it onto my podcast. So thanks to Kelsey Perry at AF & Company Marketing for dangling that Small Vines carrot in front of me. That's what a good marketing firm does. On the Wine Road podcast is sponsored by Sonoma Clean Power. Local listeners can learn how their actions can make a greater impact with clean, renewable energy at poweringeverydaymoments.org. That's poweringeverydaymoments.org. I don't know any winemaker who wanted to first grow his or her own grapes before making the wine, and that's the path you took.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting road. My wine career is kind of like a series of light bulbs going off in my head as I started off as a young sommelier working at John Ash & Company the day I turned 21, starting to study wine, and shortly after that becoming a wine steward. And then path ultimately led to desiring to kind of redesign vineyards in Sonoma County to make the style of wine that we wanted to produce.
Yeah, you're forming it your own way. It's interesting. There are a few people who have come out of John Ash & Company who've made some excellent Pinot Noir, and I guess they had a nice wine list over there for you guys to get a familiarity with. But the Epiphany wine was a guy who offered you a sample of something that he was tasting. Was that also at John Ash?
Yeah, it was kind of near the end of my my career there, and this gentleman came in and ordered a bottle of Domaine de la Romani Conti, 1978 Romani Conti vineyard. And
what year was this?
It was in 1995.
Okay, wow.
That was definitely my epiphany wine of what the threshold of Pinot Noir at its highest level could be.
And that was the major light bulb that went on?
I would say that was really what got me researching what is it that might be able to be done in making or producing Pinot Noir that is not being done at this point in California. And that was kind of my search, my quest that I started researching.
So fortunately, your wife, Kathryn, is an adventure seeker and likes being out in nature like you do. And it's funny, I just found out you guys started before you were even married, working in this endeavor.
Yeah, I met her actually my last day at John Ash & Company rock climbing out at the coast, and that's how I got introduced to her. And we were friends for a few months, and then best friends, and then went on a 10-month road trip traveling around the western half of the U.S. and she's the best thing that ever happened to me. We wouldn't be where we're at today without her. So it's amazing.
A road trip is a good test of a relationship.
That's for sure. You can live for 10 months on the road together. You're going to be fine.
And then once you kind of had an idea what you wanted to do, you went and toured Europe too, and looking at the different vineyards and the styles over there, the techniques?
Yeah, it took me a few years after we started developing vineyards on the western part of the Sonoma coast in 1998. And that was after working for the Dutton family and Warren Dutton, who are just amazing folks. And Warren was such an incredible mentor.
I was going to say, he seemed like he was a mentor for you.
Yeah, Warren was a pioneer planting Chardonnay out there, so many years ago. that he, I think, really encouraged us to just pioneer this idea. It pointed out we weren't going to learn how to plant high-density vineyards in college. In California, that's not what they're in the business of teaching. And so we just kind of jumped on the horse and started doing it in '98, thanks to Warren's kind of encouragement, and the whole family was incredibly supportive. Joe and Steve were already kind of taking over a lot of the operations, worked closely with them. They're just, and Gail, just wonderful people. So.
But you did take some classes. You got a viticulture degree, right? Beforehand.
Yeah, this was when JC, had an incredible viticulture program. You spent a lot of time out in the vineyards pruning and walking a lot of different sites. And Rich Thomas was kind of at the helm there. And so I got a degree in all my biology, soil science, plant science, all of that stuff from the junior college, and decided to start planting vineyards after that, rather than moving on in college. So
when you were planting vineyards for other people, were you planting the high density vineyards at that time? Or were you trying to talk them into that, or were you doing more traditional plantings?
It was a very new idea for the area, so it did take some convincing, but I think most of the vineyards properties that we were being introduced to were smaller acreage properties. So it kind of made sense to people to plant a little higher density. If you only had 3 acres to plant, why not plant more vines and see do something unique with it. And so it did take a little bit of convincing, and obviously not everybody was on board with that because the costs are higher. It costs you a certain amount per vine, and if you're planting 3.5 times more vines per acre, it's going to be more expensive to develop that property. So not everybody was on board, but quite a few people. I've planted over 40 vineyards out on the coastal hills over the past 23 years, and so it's been quite a journey.
And the way that you're able to plant more vines is because you make the spacing tighter between each row of vines, and the vines are a little bit closer too. Is that true as well?
So the spacing we have is a 4-foot tractor row and 3 feet between vines, and that spacing is really determined by PhD level soil science, so it's not right for every single vineyard planting. But when you find those soils that are appropriate, usually they're in the Gold Ridge soils where you have a Franciscan or Merced layer down at about 2 feet deep. And that really can restrict the vine's growth potential. And that's the ideal scenario for a high density planting. So the average spacing out in that area is an 8-foot tractor row with 5 feet between vines. So we end up with 3,630 vines per acre versus the average of 1,089 vines per acre.
Right.
So it's quite a bit more dense.
And I like how you refer to the 4-foot as a tractor row, and you're just saying that because that's what you call it. It's the wider space, but you can't get a tractor in a 4-foot row unless you buy one from Europe like you did.
Well,
eventually.
Yes. That was kind of in the beginning, we figured let's plant the vineyards that we want to make wine from. And then rather than planting the vineyards around the tractors that were available to farm, we said we'll go seek the tractors. We know other parts of the world are planting high density, and almost all of the Pinot Noir in Europe is planted extremely high density. That's something that reading Jancis Robinson's Oxford Companion to Wine many, many years ago, that she alluded to, that Pinot Noir needed to be, a low-yielding plant made the best expression. So we went to Europe, and that's when we really started traveling after we had several vineyards planted, and we really started traveling to Europe to say, how can we mechanize this efficiently? How can we really turn this into where we're no less efficient than our neighbors farming an 8-foot tractor row in this 4-foot setting?
Because by 4 foot, you'd have to do it by hand. More or less,
or walk behind, mowers or something like that. We were not into that. That was not our go-to-market plan.
So you found the Caval 3x3,
yes,
which is interesting because it's really wide, and the center where you sit is in one row, and then the other two where the wheels are out, and the other rows on either side. Really interesting looking thing.
Yeah, that's been an amazing part. I mean, they're maybe more maintenance. I know they're more maintenance, because they're very lightweight, which soil compaction is an issue when you get that close together. So we wanted them to be very lightweight so they didn't compact the soil. It was quite an adventurous part of starting the business, traveling to Europe and then modifying the tractor, making sure that the engine and all the components were things we could service here in the U.S. And, this was before our first trip to Burgundy was when my wife was pregnant with our son, who's now 18. So,
wow.
It was, we were very young and really trying to explore and push the limits of what was possible.
And when you have a tractor like that that's spread out like that, the spacing has to be measured perfectly because you have these little cutting knives that trim down the weeds just before the vines on
Right.
either side. So it has to be very precise.
It does, and believe it or not, they're adjustable, so you can adjust the width of the arms hydraulically, and there on those weed knives there are little sensors that trigger off of the plant that kind of move the knife around.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works.
But there is what we call tractor blight, and you have to be very careful.
Oh, yes.
In this spacing, you have to be very sensitive of that. So.
Isn't that an interesting story of how they decided to start their own vineyard development company so they could eventually plant their own vineyard to grow the type of grapes that suit the style of wine they chose to make? Then having to buy European machinery to harvest the grapes. We'll get into more techniques he's incorporated and talk about their wines when Paul Sloan of Small Vines returns on the Wine Road.
Life is made up of everyday moments. The best breakfast pancakes and bedtime stories, staying up too late and getting up too early. As your public power provider, we at Sonoma Clean Power thrive on sustaining everyday moments, and we do so with a clean energy future in mind. We know these moments are cherished forever. Together, we can protect today's moments and those yet to come. Learn how your actions can make an even greater impact at poweringeverydaymoments.org.
Thank you for listening to On the Wine Road podcast. I'm talking with Paul Sloan of Small Vines in Sonoma County, and one of the reasons I wanted to hear his story is due to the fact that an esteemed British writer and critic, Jancis Robinson, was quoted as saying, "Small Vines is one to watch." That's quite a compliment coming from her. There are other accolades as well, like exciting, outstanding Pinots from Wine Spectator. Let's get back to the interview. And you learned that high-density, narrow rows produce less fruit per vine, but produces grapes that are smaller, but a greater intensity.
Right.
And that's what you were looking for.
Exactly. And, working in the restaurant world, when I was first studying wine, I was devouring every book on wine I could find. So I read her book from cover to cover, The Oxford Companion to Wine.
Which is like
it's an encyclopedia.
Yeah, that's quite a book.
And she's a huge inspiration for us. But when I got to the part that was about Pinot Noir, it said that it was the most yield-sensitive red wine varietal in the world. And what that means is that by having more crop on the plant, you can have an inverse relationship to the quality of the fruit. Now, of course, balance in a vine is the number one most important thing, and that's why not every site is appropriate for high density. If you have a little more vigorous soil, you're better off having a bigger vine. So I'm very clear about that. But balancing the plant with the crop load. So reading that, and then there was another section in her book on spacing where she said that it is true that most of the best wines in the world come from extremely high density plantings. I decided to kind of link those two and start researching, and that's really one of the very first points where the light bulb went off that maybe spacing has more to do with vineyard design and wine style and quality than America is leading on to, that maybe we're designing vineyards around tractors more than designing vineyards for the highest wine quality.
Yeah.
And that's something that over the past 23 years I've seen fairly dramatically. A lot of people are planting a lot higher density plantings now than we were. Everything back then was kind of 8x5 was the standard. And you see a lot more innovation to spacing these days, which is kind of fun to see.
And canopy management, but you're suggesting that a little bit thicker canopy is better, not to get too much sunlight onto the grapes.
Yeah, I do prefer kind of maintaining the primary leaves and reducing the amount of solar radiation on the fruit to preserve the nuance. I believe that Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are very nuanced varietals, and that California, if we have one thing, we have a lot of sunshine, and protecting the fruit is one of our challenges. I prefer to make wines where we have no additions whatsoever to the wine other than sulfur as a preservative right before bottling. So I don't want to have to add acid, and I don't want to worry about the alcohol content. I want all of those to be in balance in the vineyard when I harvest the grapes. And the vineyard design helps me achieve that by reducing the sunlight exposure to the fruit. So.
And you guys finally found your own property. It was 2007, but you made a little bit of wine before that using this high density spacing, and you were impressed with how it tasted?
Exactly. From day one, we didn't feel that the vineyards we wanted to make wine from existed. So we started planting these high density vineyards, saved our money from that. Then we started leasing back a few vineyards. Back in 2005 was the very first we leased. We made 75 cases of wine.
Smart move. Way to do it.
It was a kind of an innovative way to become an estate grower producer.
Yeah.
From high-density vineyards when you couldn't go out and buy fruit from high-density vineyards. And then ultimately we had saved enough money in 2007 to purchase the original Barlow homestead up on Barlow Lane in Sebastopol.
Interesting. And, how long did it take to harvest enough grapes to bottle a vintage from that property?
So we bought it in 2007, planted the vines in 2009, and got our first grapes off of it in 2012.
Yeah.
So it took a while.
And you call that TBH? I didn't ask you earlier. What does that stand for?
Well, there's the Barlow Center down in Sebastopol, where the Barlow family kind of is maybe the most famous for developing that kind of warehouse district, where some great wineries like Costa Brown and Pax Mele has his wines down there, and all the breweries and stuff down there. But before that, the Barlow family was actually the largest berry growers, and then they interplanted apples on their 154-acre farm up on Barlow Lane. And they built a 6,000 square foot apple packing barn on that property. And that is where the home of our winery is. So we refer to that as the Barlow Homestead. You've got the Barlow Center, which is where they moved to kind of expand their warehousing. But the Barlow Homestead is
TBH.
Yeah,
the Barlow Homestead. But you are still leasing from other vineyards that you helped plant, or that you did plant, and so you're sourcing from what 5, 6, 7 different vineyards now?
Yeah, we have 6 vineyards under lease and the one that we own.
Okay.
So it's and everything's estate grown in that we have a long-term lease on all of the properties and farm everything organically out there.
Quite a few Pinot clones you're using as well, like 7 of them.
I think it's more like 14 at this point. Okay. Some of them are in pretty small quantities.
The ones that are already bottled. So.
Yeah. So it's kind of crazy. That's a lifetime study right there.
Oh, gosh.
Plant material.
No kidding. And some classics with your Chardonnay, Hyde, Wente, Kistler.
Yeah, exactly. And we kind of realized as we started planting a lot of them that the Calera selection, Swan, the Hyde, Wente, and Kistler Mount Eden selection were kind of our favorites. And so focused that in on the TBH vineyard.
So starting with your own vineyard, or your own idea of a vineyard to grow the grapes that you want to grow and make the wine you want to make, do you feel that your efforts could be replicated by someone else?
I feel that maybe even improved upon. What I know today, I knew nothing when I started, and I feel like I have so much more to learn. But I think that if people have the gumption to be a farmer and a winemaker, that starting a vineyard development company is an interesting way to get estate-grown fruit from vineyards planted the way you want to plant them on a diverse array of properties. And it hadn't really been done, but it was kind of my vision. I grew up on a 250-acre horse and cattle ranch here in Sonoma County, and so I wanted to work outside, and my love for food and wine kind of led me that vineyards were easier to care for than horses and cows were. So,
you don't get bucked off a vine very often, do you?
Yeah, that's true.
And the ability to lease back, too. If you plant a vineyard, then you can lease the grapes back, and you're very familiar with it if you planted it, so you know it so well.
Yeah, and the people, I work with some really wonderful people that we get to work with their land and stuff, and I just can't thank them enough for believing in us and letting us be stewards of their property. And so Matt and Ann Keller and the Baranoff family and, the Fisher family at the Old Mill property, it's just some wonderful, wonderful folks.
Well,
so,
they're the epitome of Sonoma County.
Exactly.
That's why we love living here. Everybody is so kind and easy to work with and talk with. So I take it you're looking for this to be a traditional, long-running family business because you have kids. And
I really want my kids to explore the world and travel and kind of develop who they are as a person. And if they want to come back to this, it's here for them. My wife and I have definitely done this with a lot of help from other people, but no equity investors. So there's no reason we'll have to sell or change anything. So it's available to them, and we hope that it's a generational business. But I want them to find something they're passionate about, and that's the most important thing to me. Yeah. So.
Well, Paul, thanks so much for coming in and joining me today, and I'm pleased to hear your story. It's very interesting.
Well, I think the thanks goes out to you, Jeff, for having me on the show and inviting me in. So I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to get to know you, and thank you very much.
He's a heck of a guy and doing some very interesting work. Paul Sloan of Small Vines. Visit their website for information on how to join their mailing list, book a private tasting, and acquire their extremely limited single vineyard Sonoma County Pinot Noir and Chardonnay at smallvines.com. Today's episode was written, recorded, and produced by me. Please subscribe to On the Wine Road podcast so each episode will automatically appear on your favorite platform. Find images, wine news, trivia, and more interviews at onthewineroad.us. I'm on Facebook as On the Wine Road and Instagram as JD Wine Road. I'll talk to you again soon as I share more from my travels on the Wine Road.